Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome
to another edition of Thirsty Thursday with SipScout and the Crafty.
Yes, exactly. And we have such a treat for you tonight. Let me tell you, we are so excited about this. We are doing a bourbon tasting. We've done whiskey tastings in the past where we did all different styles of whiskey to get you familiar with them. But now, and then we did our American single malt tasting where we had a bunch of American single malt makers with us. And this time we are going deep into bourbon, America's spirit. Although the American single malt guys would say that's going to change. They think that American single malt's going to become America's spirit. So yeah, we are so excited tonight. We are going to have throughout the night, we'll have different makers joining. Right now we have 2 of the 4 who will be joining us tonight. And so we will have some makers joining us, which is always a lot of fun. More fun, right? Everyone who's here often than just us talking at you about this stuff.
I mean, we're pretty fun.
We are. We try. For those of you who are new to us, welcome. I'm Suzanne. I'm the founder of the Crafty Cask, where we are all about celebrating and support craft alcohol makers like these fabulous 6 that we will be talking about today.
And my name is Evan. I am a certified sommelier, certified cider professional, mixologist, whiskey enthusiast, and particularly bourbon enthusiast. And yeah, we're thrilled to be talking to you about these delicious bourbons. And getting you excited about the craft revolution as it pertains to bourbon, because you can find a lot of bourbons out there, but finding the craft ones is where you find the fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm finding the good craft ones because, you know, like these are some of our favorites. These are some of our favorites. So before we talk too much, because we're going to give a little bit of an overview, we're going to give you a little bit of a sneak preview to what's coming up next month with SipScout. But before we do that, I want to just have Hannah and Crispin, since they're here, just say a quick hello and just tell us your name, where you're from, and then we'll come back to you momentarily to do your tastings.
Hannah, would you like to go first?
No, you go for it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm Crispin Cain. I am president of Tamar Distillery, American Craft Whiskey Distillery and Mendocino Spirits. I am the distiller and man in charge of the cellar. So I just briefly had the great good fortune to start with Jermaine Robin Brandy many years ago, and I feel really privileged to be here today. Thank you.
We feel very privileged to have you. You are a name that many people in the whiskey industry know for sure. So thank you for joining us, Crispin.
Yeah, thanks, Crispin.
Hannah?
Awesome. So I'm Hannah. I'm with Oregon Spirit Distillers. I am the director of sales and marketing. I'm super excited to be here today. Unfortunately, no one from our production team could be here, but I'm excited to launch us and taste everyone through it.
Happy to have you either way.
Thrilled to have you. And last month, our members can attest, we had the director of marketing for Eden Ciders with us. And man, she was a hit. Everyone just really loved hearing everything she had to say, and about production too, because you guys have to know all of it when you're in marketing and sales. Yeah. So we're excited to have you here. Awesome. Colin, we're just doing some quick introductions. Just hello, where you're from, and a little intro. I think you're on mute.
Got it. I'm Colin. I'm the founder and distiller of Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in Kentucky. That's how I got interested in whiskey in the first place. So decided to, of course, start making bourbon in Brooklyn, which may or may not make sense 14 years later. And so excited to talk with everybody.
We are
happy to have you here. Thank you, Colin.
We are thrilled to have you here. For those of you who've been following the Crafty Cats for a while, you may have seen one of our earliest articles, honestly, was on Kings County Distillery. And I kind of discovered them when I was at a conference for my old corporate job still. It was right in the beginnings when I was just getting started with this. And I wandered in, and I just have to say their facility and what they're doing in the space of whiskey really made me fall in love and get ready to take the leap to do the Crafty Cask full time. So we're excited to have you here. Our cat is being very noisy tonight. We're going to try to keep it under control. We're not sure what's going on, but we'll get it under control here. Alex, we'd love to have you do a quick introduction as well.
Hi, my name is Alex Hilton. I'm from Mad River Distillers. We're located in central Vermont, and we have been operating as a craft distillery for about 10 years now.
Yes, and we are thrilled to have you here. I actually got to bring Evan up there on his very first trip to Burlington. He had never been to Vermont before, let alone Burlington, which is an amazing, amazing town for those of you who haven't been, and we got to go to Mad River Distillers and hang out there, and it's a great space, and we love what you're doing as well.
Love that.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much.
And Phyllis, welcome from Durham, North Carolina. All of our other guests, we'd love to know where you're joining from if you feel like throwing it in the chat. And we will kind of get started here. But as we're talking, so what we normally do, again, for those of you who are a little bit newer to us, what we normally do is for about the first 45 minutes or so, we do this in webinar format so we can make sure to get you all of the great education and listen to us nerd out about bourbon tonight is what we're going to do probably. And, you know, talk about the tasting, go through everything that our SipScout members got in their kit this month. And then after that, we will allow everyone to get promoted to panelists so that you can turn on your video, unmute yourself, and just chit chat with everyone who is here directly. So kind of happy hour style, and get to ask the distillers and the team your questions. So that is what we're going to do for the evening. Evan's going to walk us through briefly some whiskey tasting techniques momentarily, just to make sure everyone knows how to kind of taste through these as we're talking through them and get the most out of their tasting. But before we do that, I want to do a quick PSA for
promo time.
And next month is super exciting. So our SipScout kit next month is a Aqua V and Bunny Mary cocktail kit, just in time for Easter. So we're featuring, actually, we're doing one feature. So all Norden Aqua V, they're from Michigan. And I always can never turn my things the right way on my camera. And so we're going to be all Norden Aqua V. The distiller will be joining us as well. Whiskey down. Will be joining us as well. And so he'll be talking all about Aqua V. And if you're not familiar with Aqua V, let me tell you, it is one of my all-time favorites. If you like gin, you'll probably like Aqua V because it's botanical, very similar to gin, except the predominant note in Aqua V is caraway or dill typically, not juniper. And so if you don't like gin, because you don't like those heavy juniper flavors that some of them have, where it tastes a little bit like a Christmas tree, some of them, only some of them, there are plenty of gins out there that don't. If you don't like gin for that reason, then Aqua V is probably for you as well, because it doesn't have that element to it. So either way, Aqua V is awesome. And if you haven't had it, this is an amazing way to get into Aqua V and really learn about it and go deep. There's a barrel-aged one, there's the standard one, there's a dill one, and then there's also a rhubarb kind of rosé special edition one. So we're really excited about that Aqua V kit. And then we'll also be
Bunny Mary is super good. It's carrot juice based, and that just plays so nicely
with the dill Aqua V.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
And if you think Bloody Marys are typically like too acidic for you, it's an awesome brunch cocktail to kind of do something different there. So we'll be making that as well. So that's next month's SipScout kit, which we're super excited about. And with that, I think we're ready to get started.
Lovely. Phyllis is familiar with Jermaine Raban, Crispin. So
yeah, that's
Phyllis,
going to be one of our
here. Yeah.
That will be our first tasting of the evening. So I'm sure Crispin will tell us a little bit about that history when we start there. So this is the order we'll be tasting in. Evan, do you want to do us a quick rundown of whiskey tasting techniques, just real high level for those of you who need a little assistance here?
All right. So in brevity, as much as I'm capable of doing this, which is
hard to do.
Sometimes Suzanne kind of is punching me under the
table. We both have a hard time.
Moving along. Anyway, when you're enjoying distilled spirits, the first caution I have is don't do what you do when you're doing wine tastings. Don't go ahead and stick your nose right in there and take a big whiff, because you're going to burn out your nose. You're going to burn out your olfactory. High proof distillates will really shut it down. So approach it with caution. Initial step is always kind of to visually evaluate the spirit. You're looking for the depth of color as well as any kind of opacity, cloudiness that might indicate the non-use of chill filtering. Chill filtering strips out a lot of the elements that would cause a spirit to be cloudy, which for the general consumer makes it more appealing, frankly. The first time I saw Hefeweizen, I was like, what's wrong with that beer? But those fatty acids and those esters that are stripped out when you do chill filtering actually lend a lot of character and a lot of aroma personality to a spirit. So the lack of chill filtration sometimes can, while it makes something that looks a little weird, can actually lend to a really beautiful, beautiful spirit.
And for those of you, when you see on some of the bottles in the stores, triple filtered, quadruple filtered, 8 times filtered. That's the, like, they're training us as Americans, like bigger is always better. Not necessarily. You're really stripping out a lot of that flavor when you do that. So
and then you want to nose the glass. The sensations that you're going to get are going to be introduced pretty far away. I was just saying, don't stick your nose right in there. I actually start with the glass kind of underneath my chin, and I'll slowly bring it up, sniffing all the while until I can begin to get some aromas, which for me is about the time the rim of the glass gets to my chin level. And you'll get aromas that will indicate different components of the process of making a whiskey. Primary aromas are going to be coming from the grains that are used. So the aromas that you'll get from the use of corn, primarily, like in bourbon, will be different than the aromas that you get from rye or barley or a rye whiskey or for like a Scottish whiskey. And so those are the ones that you're going to get first, because those are the most aromatic. They're going to be kind of leaping out of the glass. You can get those aromas more readily with short, quick inhalations and exhalations through your nose. Just
think about how a dog sniffs when they're looking for something. If you do that, and if you do have your nose a little closer and you actually add a little humidity in there when you're doing it, because you're blowing out from your nose as well, that humidity helps you catch those lighter notes as well.
There are aromas that come from the actual process of fermentation and distillation. Generally, those are kind of minimal. And then the tertiary aromas come from primarily the barrels. That's what gives it the color as well. Those tend to be heavier. Think about dry ice and the way that the, I guess, cloudy fog
wafts over the side and kind of falls out.
It's right on. So those heavy aromas, the volatile aromas from the grain, are wafting out of there, where the heavier aromas kind of sit in the glass right on top of that. So tilting that glass on the side, careful.
And this is good to do with your first whiskey of the night.
Bringing your nose nearby, and instead of those short, quick inhalation exhalations, do a long, slow inhalation.
This is your yoga breath.
And that's when you're going to get those, instead of like floral kind of citrus fruity notes, that long, slow inhalation, the aromas that you're going to get from the barrel are going to be more baking spices, leather, tobacco, chocolate, things like that.
Caramel, right.
And then take a sip. Something that's helpful before you take that first sip, kind of chew your tongue a little bit, roll it around in your mouth. That's going to create saliva in your mouth, which is going to protect the inside of your mouth from the shock of a high proof spirit. Even with wine, it's helpful to get some saliva in your mouth. The saliva protects your mouth, but it also helps transmit flavors to your taste buds. So chewing a little bit before you take that first sip is something that I highly recommend. And then once you take that sip, chew the sip in your mouth.
In Kentucky, they call this the Kentucky Chew.
Kentucky Chew. Just kind of roll it around in there. You don't want to swish it, but let it get, push it up into the roof of your mouth. Let it cascade down your cheeks, pool up underneath your tongue. There's taste buds all over the inside of your mouth. You
really want it to get everywhere in your mouth, almost as a primer coat. So you want it to kind of prime your mouth, because otherwise that first sip it's just reactive. That first sip, since it's high proof, your mouth is just going like, whoa, what is that? And so you don't really want to assess something on the first sip. You want to use it as a primer, like Evan's doing right now. And then once your mouth is acclimated to that proof, that taste, then you take a second sip, and that's when you start to kind of assess it. And then the final.
And then after you've swallowed, the persistence of a bourbon, after it's no longer in your mouth, how long it continues to present itself to your senses is one of the, I think, better indicators overall of the quality of a spirit, the balance and the way the perceived sweetness and the heat and the spice all kind of stay in harmony and continue to be pleasant after you've swallowed is an important thing to take note of, and is one of the most enjoyable parts of enjoying a nice dram.
And that's also as you get, more experience with tasting and you start to use these techniques more often, that will allow you to start to differentiate between, I don't like this, and that's low quality, right? That finish, that kind of savor at the end. And that's an important distinction, because you might not like something. It might not be for your palate. You might not prefer it, but it might be very high quality, or vice versa. And so that's kind of a helpful way to kind of think through that a little bit. All right, if anyone has questions on tasting notes as we're going through, feel free to throw them in the chat. We just wanted everyone to be prepared to enjoy these as fully as possible as we go through our tasting. But with that, I think we should get started with our first low gap, and we'll clear some of these out of the way. So we're just focused there. Crispin, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your history, the tasting notes of this as we get started here?
Sure, thank you. And the two of you are just great. Thank you so much for all of this. This is really cool. I briefly, I began working at a winery about 40 years ago, and I ended up working at the Jermaine Robin Distillery a bit more than 34 years ago. And it's been a long journey in wine and spirits. I'm really glad I found this path in my life. And bourbon. You know, my first day of work with Hubert Germain Robin, he said, one day we'll have to make bourbon. And what did I know about bourbon at the time? I'm in my 20s. I knew wine. I said, what do you want to make bourbon for? And he said, because this is what Americans really want. And to some great extent, he's right. You know, bourbon and gin, I saw more bourbon and gin than anything else. And this particular bourbon, the mash bill in this bourbon is 65% corn, 20% malted barley, and 15% malted rye and unmalted rye in this one.
Hey, Crispin, since you're kicking us off here, would you mind giving people the definition of bourbon as a whole, just as for the category started?
Gosh, the words straight bourbon whiskey are like the most heavily regulated words in our business. It must be made in the United States of America. It must be distilled from an original mash composed of at least 3 grains. Must be 51% a single grain, and usually that's corn. It must be distilled, and the final distillation proof must be less than 80% and greater than 65. It must, we can only add water to bourbon and nothing else. We must barrel bourbon or straight bourbon whiskey at between 60 and 62.5% alcohol by volume. It must go into new charred barrels, and usually that's American oak. It must remain undisturbed for a minimum of 24 months, and then we may use the word straight bourbon whiskey. So that's the rundown on what straight bourbon whiskey is. And as a side note, any straight whiskey, anything that says straight whiskey, has had that 24 months in charred oak treatment. So this particular bourbon, I began in 2016 buying barrels from Canton Cooperage in Lebanon, Kentucky, and I'm very fortunate to get their best wood, which seems to make a big difference. Getting 36-month air-dried wood. Something that is done with French oak and cognac and fine wines and good spirits. I started out buying barrels from Independent Stave early on in the project, and it made good whiskey, and we sold all of that whiskey. But it was 24-month cured wood. It was a really good deal. Barrels were cheaper then. And when things changed for Independent Stave, I switched to Canton. And I've had a good relationship with them over these years, and we're making good whiskey with their barrels, and this is a fine example of it. I'm very fortunate to have been taught to distill by Hubert, and I continue to abide by the use of pot stills and a double distillation method. You know, the tradition of distillation in cognac has been master to apprentice for centuries, and so I'm very fortunate to be part of that. And I feel it gives me the opportunity to select the very finest heart of the second distillation that we put to barrel. And then backing up a bit, you know, I came into this with a firm grasp of fermentation from my winemaking background. And I approached the fermentation from a winemaking perspective rather than a beer making perspective per se. And so it's really essential that we're using enzymes and even champagne yeast to ferment to dryness. And that allows us clean fractionation at distillation, steady boiling points, no pulsing in the still, no turning over. It's just seems to be what works for me.
Yeah.
So having control of the process from selection of ingredients, fermentation, distillation, barreling, um, blending, élevage, the whole process, all the way down to the product going in the bottle. I'm present for all of that, and I'm happy with the product that we're producing these days.
Yeah,
We are
as
too.
well. We are as well. We've been fans for a long time, and I think the first one we ever had from yours was the 2-year, right? With a while back, and I remember that 2-year kind of drinking like butter, like it was just so smooth and so like lovely.
Butterscotch.
Yeah, butterscotch probably more, but it really I have a very visceral memory of that. Before we jump in your tasting, we do have a question from one of our guests. They're curious, how else can you dry out a barrel? Are there other ways to dry out a barrel, and how does that change the taste?
Well, what happens with drying wood and curing wood outdoors is the wood is split or cut and stacked so that air can get between the rough staves. And what happens over time is the green character in the wood is diminished, and what we're left with is the yummy brown stuff that we want to have as color in the whiskey. And what other ways? I'm not a cooperage. All I know is at Canton Cooperage, they have yards of this wood that are third-party certified, and the third-party certifier locks up the gate on the yard and comes back to that same place, however many months or years down the road when it gets opened up and the wood gets milled into barrels. So
Cool.
That's what I know about it.
Cool, great. Tell us about this particular whiskey and walk people through it as they're sipping on it.
All right. I am really pleased with this bourbon. The nose has malted grains and clove and vanilla and candied orange peel. You may notice, and I combined. I noticed in the rules about bourbon that we're allowed to put 2 bourbons together if we so desire and no more. And so in this, I combined my bourbon from 2016 and bourbon from 2019. And although this says 3 years old, I bottled this and the 2019 was 3 years old. The 2016 was older than that. And so I threw in 2 barrels of 2016 to give it a bit more oak, a bit more complexity, and just a good loving kick. And it seems to work doing that. I've had bourbons in the past where it was just the 1 year and those worked. But I'm always looking to, within the boundaries of straight bourbon whiskey, I'm looking to make certain improvements. And the next bourbon I will bottle will have Sonora wheat in it instead of rye. Okay, I see the question. Where does the maple flavor come from? The maple flavor comes from the combination of the malted grains I'm using and the oak, and those two together. And what's really cool is the stills I'm using, these old stills from Cognac, allow me to capture the flavor of the malted grains and the flavor of the corn really well. And the transformation that goes through from being a new spirit to an aged spirit is really remarkable. And it takes on these characters that we've all come to know and love. And my job is to create familiar flavor profiles and do them very well. And I'm not trying to make an innovative bourbon, but a well-made bourbon.
I love it. It is a very well-made bourbon, and it's so smooth. And like this to me is primarily a sipping bourbon for me, because it is just so, I want to sip on it versus mixing it into cocktails necessarily.
And I kind of feel like
about most of these. Yeah, I do feel that way about most of these tonight. Crispin, we're going to come back to you in a little bit with some more questions. So everyone, please feel free to keep putting your questions. And if we didn't get to it yet, we just want to make sure we get through our tasting with everyone. Thank you so much, Crispin. That was a great kickoff to this.
And also thank you for pointing out the edition of the 2016 and the 2019 as a note that an age statement on
Yes.
a whiskey is indicative of the youngest whiskey
Yeah.
only.
Correct.
So
Yep.
you might get some goodness of some
Additional goodness that's
yeah.
older.
But
Okay.
another note that we often like to point out is that older is not necessarily better. You know, there's a lot of kind of whiskey snobs out there that are always like, I have the 15-year, the 20-year. Older it's a preference. It's because you're going to get more of those barrel flavors and aromas that Evan was talking about before versus the more fruity, grainy characteristics. And so it really is, if you like those fruity, grainy, floral characteristics in your whiskey, you actually don't want a super aged whiskey. So there are benefits to both of them. So don't let anyone ever shame you that you're drinking your whiskey too young. That is a preference. That is not a statement of quality.
Very much so. Very much so. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. This was wonderful. All right, Colin, bring us to New York.
Yes. So Kings County Distillery is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We are a grain to glass New York State distillery. We opened in 2010. And I said before that I grew up in Kentucky, and I think that has had a huge impact on the way that we do everything. And so as a Kentuckian, I first came to love bourbon. This was my cultural inheritance. People would sort of ask me about it, and I grew up less in the bourbon part of Kentucky and really more in the moonshine part of Kentucky. But they're really two different sides of the same coin, and I was interested in both. And so but the more I learned about bourbon, the more I became deeply disappointed with what bourbon had become, which was almost entirely industrialized and commoditized. And all of its marketing was that it was small batch and made by Grandpappy's recipe and the way that they always used to make it, when in fact it was very obvious that it was not at all like the way that they used to make it. And there was this pretty glaring disconnect between what people wanted whiskey to be and what whiskey actually was. And I felt like that left room for somebody to come in and say, what if we rolled it all back and said, let's make bourbon the way it would have been made pre-prohibition, before this industrial moment happened. And I don't know if we've entirely achieved that, but we've gotten to a place where we're an all pot still distillery. That is a very important piece of what we do. We use pot stills built in Scotland that look like what you would see if you went to a single malt distillery, that sort of copper Hershey's Kiss shaped object are front and center in the distillery. And we then borrow a lot from international distilling cultures, which tend to have protected their rules around distillation a little bit more than American whiskey. So we use pot stills. We use multiple barrel formats, whether that's size of barrels or char levels, or we play around a lot with different sorts of techniques in barrel aging, and then blend them together with a high focus on the assembling of the different whiskeys after the fact. The American model is that the distiller, the master distiller, is the sort of author of the whiskeys, but in fact, at our distiller, I would argue it's the blenders, which are not me. That's Ryan and Nathan and Nicole before that. So really taking a very older, more traditional approach to making bourbon and rye whiskeys. Rye whiskey is really what used to grow and what used to be the whiskey style of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. So we do what's called an empire rye. But our bourbon is more more beloved and what we started with and closer to my heart. So this is 80% New York organic corn, 20% English malted barley. It's a Golden Promise, which is a sort of older heritage grain as far as, but a grain that was sort of hybridized and grown for the Scotch whiskey industry. So those are the two main ingredients, then double pot distillation, and then aged for anywhere from 2 to 6 years on the far side for this one. And again, and in some small barrels, some full-size barrels, but really then after they've matured, playing to put them all together. So this has barrels, yeah, anywhere from I guess to 2001 all the way down to 2018 probably for this one.
Cool. Two questions for you, Colin, based on kind of what you were just talking about. One is maybe explaining for everyone a little bit what the different barrel sizes do, what that impact is on the whiskey. And then my other question would be, in the beginning, you were kind of saying, one of the reasons you started this is you felt like the bourbon was really getting commoditized and commercialized, and like that's where it was headed, and you wanted to kind of do it the right way, in my words. And can you help people figure out how to determine that when they're shopping for bourbon?
Right. Okay. Well, it can be very hard to determine who's actually, for the most part, you have your sort of standard brands. There's, Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, and all the way. There's about a dozen sort of big name distilleries that produce, including some names that some people have never heard of, like MGP, which is just a sort of contract distillery. But those barrels get bought on a sort of commodity market and get assembled into many brands that are sort of posing as they make their own, or they have a token still on site. I mean, we have a crosstown sort of rival in Brooklyn that they have a distillery, they run it, they make a barrel of whiskey every day, but they buy hundreds of barrels from elsewhere. And so if it says distilled by, that's usually a good indication on the label that somebody is actually making their product, and that is a good thing to look for, as opposed to bottled by or produced by, which can be used on a label if they're not necessarily distilling it. But also a good way to check is to just go to the website and look for a picture of a still, which sounds kind of silly, but if we're distilling, we're proud of our stills, and we want to show that to people, because usually that is a very specific choice that we've made, and it has an impact on the product. When you go to a website and they don't have a picture of a still, I'm always a little curious why not,
I would give is what we often do, because we're always looking for craft, trying to make sure. And even for us, sometimes it's hard to determine, but we also will be in the store and Googling like, who owns this brand, right? And if it comes up a company name versus a person's name, that's also another good indicator often.
But I would also argue there's a very clear flavor differentiation between pot distilled whiskeys and column distilled whiskeys, which is evident in the viscosity of the whiskey. Pot distilled whiskey tends to have more heft, more of a buttery characteristic. And its flavors tend to be sort of foodie flavors like caramel, vanilla, molasses, chocolate, as opposed to leathery, tannic, some kinds of spices. Just sort of more intense, but also sometimes more harsh flavors that come through, because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to make a column distillate, and it can be done well, and a lot of examples of people who do it well. But ultimately, it's my personal belief, and there are people who will fight me on this one, but pot stills make more flavorful whiskey. That is the way I would phrase it, and they also give the distiller more control over the distillate, and that's also an important piece of it. But you also had a question about barrels, which is just what do small format barrels do? Smaller barrels tend to give the whiskey more flavor at a younger age, so that's not to say they're maturing the whiskey faster. But there's an interesting, this question about air dried is, I feel like, a discussion that hasn't even entered the whiskey world yet, but it's my belief that it's not that whiskey really ages in the barrel. It does, but I would say that's sort of a marginal thing. But the wood aging is actually what is conferring the most flavor and the most of what we recognize as maturation is really the maturation of the wood, not the maturation of the whiskey. Which is why having 3 years of air-dried staves means you get 3 extra years of aging on a whiskey before you put it into the barrel. And then, of course, you go another 3 years, and you actually have the equivalent of a 6-year whiskey in 3 years' time. So, but the wood is very important, and that's why a lot of Scotch whiskeys tend, as they're reusing bourbon barrels, they have barrels that might be in a 12-year whiskey, but it might be a a 20-year barrel.
Yeah.
And so, you get very interesting things out of wood when it gets old. And so that's, as a distiller, something that we pay attention to that isn't, that's not reflected in an age statement. An age statement is a very dumb piece of information, which people invest a lot in because whiskey companies don't tell their customers anything. So what do you have? You have the proof and you have the age. And if you're lucky, you know where it's distilled. That's the 3 shreds of information that most companies give you. And so no wonder people invest a lot in age and also proof, weirdly enough, which is a completely arbitrary decision by the distiller. But yeah, I mean, the opportunity that we've had as a distillery is to kind of get under the hood, share that with people, be very transparent, be very deliberate, and end up with a very different kind of spirit.
Great. Speaking of, can you tell us about what we're sipping on here? And as you do that, Phyllis had a question about why this bottle choice. It is a very unique bottle compared to many other market or whiskeys on the market.
Yeah, I mean, we started with something very minimalistic because, in fact, actually, all of these bottles behind me, we started with this, which is just when I was distilling in my apartment, and then kind of realized that sort of neon wasn't helping us in terms of presenting as serious. But really we were a small company when we got started. We're still a small company. We don't want to necessarily overdo what we're putting into the world. But this is Kings County straight bourbon whiskey. It is 3 to 6 years old, 80% corn, 20% malted barley, double pot distilled. And it is a very nice, sipping bourbon. It has a lot of caramel. It has a lot of cinnamon and nutmeg and kind of those Christmas spices, but they're balanced with that sort of buttery heft of pot distillation that I think gives it a little bit more depth than you would get from a comparably aged, comparably priced Kentucky bourbon.
Yeah, it's really lovely. And I was in the chat that people were chatting a little bit, and I was saying, I feel like these two in comparison, the first was a little bit more in the butterscotch realm, and yours to me is a little bit more in like the forest realm, for like lack of a better word. I get some freshness from it, kind of, that's a little unique, and I really enjoy that quite a bit.
Sure.
There's a question there too about open fermentation. I'm elucidating.
Yeah, and I'll just say we're a little ahead of schedule, and our next one is only a 2-minute video that someone who couldn't make it sent in. So if others are doing open fermentation and want to kind of chime in on this with Colin, we can do a little,
open fermentation
sidebar because it's a fun topic.
Sure. Well, open fermentation for us, I think other people do it differently. It just ultimately means a far less controlled fermentation, and it allows for again, I would say that we create a lot of, our barrels don't have a lot of consistency day to day. And we do that because it's a more natural process, but then it also then leads opportunities later for the blender to assemble the whiskeys from the variety of barrels that we produce. And so summer whiskeys, when they ferment in a higher temperature, open environment, will have a sort of different characteristic than winter whiskeys. Yields are slightly different depending on the time of year. And you do get some natural yeasts that come in with the yeast that you use to inoculate. So a lot of our whiskeys have a very similar characteristic, whether it's a bourbon or a rye or a single malt. There's still sort of this through line that is Kings County, and that comes both from the method of distillation, but also the yeast that we use. But I would even argue it's also the sort of wild yeast that perpetuate batch to batch, that live in the wood of the fermenters, or just in the building that get picked up by subsequent fermentations and then distillations.
The coolest thing, if you're visiting a distillery that does open fermentation and there's a batch going at the time, is it just creates this beautiful, like, bubbling mass that, and it just makes you, it's like it's alive, and it's just really, it feels very like harkens back to the way I'm sure things were. And the way they honestly probably discovered how to make alcohol way back when is like something over here started bubbling and they're like, what's going on with that, right? So,
It's the science of fermentation, despite the fact that it's been around like since civilization,
yeah.
in many respects, the knowledge that we have of it still seems to be
Like what actually happens.
has some gaps.
Yeah.
Like just because you
Right.
inoculate with this specific strain of yeast doesn't necessarily guarantee that that's going to be the one that completes the entire fermentation process.
Right. And I would also argue the science of it has to be balanced with a sensory human,
The art.
piece of it. I mean, you can do science all day, but unless you have somebody who's able to sort of discern which science is leading you in the right direction, then it's pretty meaningless. So our distillery overemphasizes the sensory aspect, sometimes at the risk of the science piece, just because we don't typically hire the chemical engineers out of the distilling schools, although we have had just chemical engineers and have chemical engineers on staff, but ultimately all of that is in the service of the sensory piece of it, and that is a thing that you don't really go to school for. You pick up on the job, or you pick it up however you pick it up, but that's how we end up in this profession and doing it day in and day out. And I would also say I know Kings County whiskeys, but I don't necessarily know somebody else's whiskeys. So being an expert in your own whiskey is not necessarily being an expert in all.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much, Colin. That was great. And those of you, if you're out in Brooklyn, definitely swing by because it's a fun little walk through history in the old naval yards and everything too. But that was wonderful. And before we move on to our next one, I did want to comment earlier. Someone was asking, when do we eat the chocolate? And that's a great question because this is a bourbon and chocolate
That's
tasting.
right.
You all got some delicious chocolates from La Belle's Chocolatier. They're up in Napa Valley. And so we would say try each one of the different styles of chocolate. You have a milk, you have a dark, and you have a dark chocolate with salt. Try each one with each whiskey. And the way that you want to do pairings is you want to try the whiskey first by itself and, assess the whiskey. Then you want to try a little piece of each chocolate by itself so you understand the chocolate. But then as you're doing this, you want to actually chew a little bit of the chocolate. Don't completely finish. Take a little sip of the whiskey just to get enough to wet it in there with it. Then finish chewing and then swallow it down. And what you're looking for is a great pairing when both are in your mouth together is when the angels sing and both of them are better. You're like, this bourbon is better with this chocolate is better with this bourbon. I never want to eat them separately again. That's a great pairing, and they're a little rare and hard to find, but that's great. And then good is if just one is better, or even if and then you can have a neutral where neither are better, but they're not worse. And then of course, what we're trying to avoid is when one is like, ooh, that makes that bourbon really sharp, or that makes that chocolate really sweet, or anything like that you don't like. But that's kind of how pairings go. And then did you guys see your extra little bonus treat in there? Was it the cutest thing ever? Was it the cutest for Happy Valentine's Day, everyone? These are called meat hearts. They are hearts that have XOXO and kiss me on them, but they're made out of beef jerky. You're welcome. We thought that was a fun little treat to go along with your whiskey too, since it was just the day after Valentine's Day.
And they also work very nicely with the bourbon.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, beef jerky and whiskey. But that's you just need a campfire and you got a vacation. What more do you need? All right. Jay loves them. Great. I love it. So our next one is Sonoma Distilling Company. And Adam was super excited to be here. And then 2 days ago, he messaged me and said his daughter was her school was having an impromptu father-daughter dance for Valentine's Day. And so I said, of course, you have to go to your daughter's father-daughter dance for Valentine's Day, of course. But he was really bummed to miss it. And so because he was bummed to miss it, he made us a video. So I feel like we're at the Oscars here where we're they're not here to accept their award in person. They're joining us by video. So here we go. Let me share his video. It's only a couple of minutes long, but you'll get to meet him and talk to him this way. All right. Can everyone see that? We're looking good.
Hi, my name is Adam Spiegel, and I am the founder and master distiller here at the Sonoma Distilling Company. I definitely appreciate you joining me. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there virtually to say hi to you and answer your questions, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about my Sonoma Distilling brand. This is one I actually started about 14 years ago. I was the 15th distillery in California. Now there's roughly about 275 within the first couple hundred United States, and now there's close to almost 2,300. And what's really unique about us since day one is we've been whiskey focused. So we don't make gins or vodkas or rums or anything else. And so what I think is really great about that is allowed me to be very, very sort of myopic about what I do. It's allowed me to keep my head down and sort of get really good at sort of mastering one particular thing. And so you all are going to be trying my California bourbon. So what this is a combination of two different styles of bourbon. Some we make in-house, a little bit that we sourced outside. The majority is obviously us. And that's a combination of high rye bourbon and wheated bourbon. So for those who understand the bourbon industry very well, whatever the secondary and tertiary grains are of those mash bills is what really drives up a lot of that flavor. And so this product is largely corn with rye, wheat, and a little bit malted barley in there. Two different mash bills blended together and really trying to make something that's cohesive, spicy, has a lot of that nice long finish on there too, good mouthfeel. You can use it anywhere you like. You can put it into a cocktail if you wish. You can drink it neat. There's really good food pairings as well. I talk about food pairings all the time, but this one with my roasted chickens and duck fat fries have really always been my go-to on that one. And I really hope you enjoy it. I mean, again, making bourbon here in California, largely grain to glass for the majority of our existence, is a different path, but it's one that I really have enjoyed. It's allowed me to mature and get better at every single batch. And I really think you'll start to see some of the subtle differences between us and other people. A big one for us, something I should have mentioned earlier, we use for a long time use direct fired pot stills, but we today now use a giant Scottish still. And that big, huge pot still is really driving up flavor by adding viscosity and mouthfeel, unlike a column still. And so if you taste something and you're chewing on it for a little while, there's a reason for that. That's our pot still talking, and definitely something we're proud of. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Please follow us at Sonoma Whiskey, and we'll continue to keep the conversation open and look forward to meeting you one day in person at a whiskey dinner or a tasting or something like that. Cheers. Thank you.
Yay, that was so nice of Adam
Yeah.
to do that for us. And he got so much information in there in 2 minutes.
And
Very
I love
impressive.
the way it dovetailed very nicely into what you were saying, Colin, with the texture that you get from a pot still and that kind of oily viscosity, that weight that he was hearkening as well.
Yeah. And
Confirmation.
absolutely. Yeah. You'll notice that a lot of, people who are talking with us today are talking about their choice in still and how that really makes a big difference in, what they're making and their belief. And that is part of the art, that's kind of like a musician choosing which type of guitar to play, right? Like it is part of their art to really think about what is that instrument that you're going to use to bring your art to life. And so now I feel like the difference with these, so now I have kind of butterscotchy for the first one, a little bit more foresty for the second one. This one, the grain is really speaking to me a lot on this third one.
Cereal.
Yeah, I'm really getting that. And, they do use a lot of heirloom grains in Sonoma, and, they choose their grains carefully to support that. So, and they are grain to glass.
And this is a 4-grain bourbon. This is predominantly corn, of course, but there's also wheat, rye, and malted barley in this.
Yeah, quite lovely.
Yeah.
All right, Hannah, you ready to bring us over to Oregon Spirit Distillers?
Yeah, sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and talk about our whiskey first, just so that everyone can be tasting kind of as I talk about the distillery.
Sure.
So in front of you guys today, we have our bourbon. This is our flagship top selling product. It is something that we're super proud of and super excited to be sharing today. So it is a 4-grain, 4-year at 94 proof. So similar to, kind of fun that you guys get to try Sonoma right before this, because they are kind of a similar mash bill. We are also doing corn, rye, malted barley, and wheat. So it's 66% corn, 18% rye, and then 8% malted barley and 8% wheat. So we're not in the high rye category. We're not over that 20% threshold, but we certainly have a pretty decent rye content, which you're certainly going to taste in there. I think it gives it some nice spice on the finish that you guys will taste as doing that. So this one is at 94 proof, a little bit lower proof than we have some like single barrel picks at a higher proof. But this we think is a nice level for if people are cocktailing with. It's still high enough that it stands up really well in cocktails. But it's low enough that we think that it's just super drinkable. Certainly great with a little bit of water if you want to open it up a bit, but really nice kind of just as it is. So talking about that a little bit, we talked a lot about, aging, and, it's been super interesting hearing about everyone else's whiskeys. I've learned a lot tonight as well. But we use new white American oak. We age it for 4 years. And we are located in Bend, where we have a ton of seasonality, which is awesome for aging whiskey. So we have, pretty hot summers, cold winters, and then day to day, month to month, year to year, we have kind of a lot of different seasonality. Yesterday, being in the mountains yesterday, it was sunny in the morning, and then we had a foot of snow by evening. So we see a lot of changes there, which is really great. You're going to see a lot of expansion and contraction in the barrel, which is what we want for that aging process. We think that really, represents the high desert as you're, drinking that whiskey. But we have a couple of other really great things here in Bend for making whiskey. And one of those things is grain. So a lot of people think of Oregon. They think of the wet side of Oregon. They think about rain. We're not on that part of Oregon. We are east of the Cascades. So we are definitely in the high desert. And we have fantastic grain over here. So especially, kind of around us, but especially east of us, we have awesome grain that goes into that whiskey. And then the final thing that goes into our whiskeys that I think makes it really special is the water here is just phenomenal. I'm a little bit biased, but Bend water is, the best I've ever had in the world. I'm always excited to come back and drink our water, straight out of the tap. It's awesome, which makes it really easy to make, great whiskey because the water is an important element as well. So yeah, like I said, that one in front of you, 4 year, 4 grain, 94 proof. So you guys can be sipping on that kind of while I talk about the distillery. So we are a family-run small batch distillery out of Bend. As I said, we started out super small. The owner kind of started it as just a hobby. He bought a still and was distilling in his garage, which we don't recommend for fire purposes. And he quickly decided that it was time to move it to from a hobby into a real business. So he and his wife opened a tiny distillery. They both worked full-time as they, they would take turns operating the still day and night while they worked full-time jobs on opposite schedules, and raised their 5-year-old daughter at the time. So they were very busy people. But quickly we grew. That was in 2009. Since then, they've moved into a much bigger facility, not too far away from the original. And we're now in 28 states. So we're, and we're constantly growing. A lot of my job, like I said, I'm not on the production side, so I can't talk as much about, some of those elements, but I am on the side of, finding new states, opening new territories. So that's what I spend most of my time doing.
You're the person all the consumers get to thank that they get to even drink your, so her job is very important to all of you, because without her, they could be making the best whiskey in the world, but if no one's out there getting it into the stores, it doesn't matter. So
somebody's got to do it, I got to get it out there. So our distillery really focuses on, what is most important to us is the terroir and the agriculture of Oregon and surrounding areas. So in all of our spirits, and we make, we have our bourbon, we also make several other whiskeys, but we also make, gin, vodka, we also make limoncello. So we have kind of a big range going of products. We really try to capture regional and local flavor profiles as much as we can. So, 95% of our grains are sourced from Oregon, and then the other 5% are sourced from the Pacific Northwest, a little bit of malted barley from Washington, a little bit of corn from Idaho. And then with some other products like, limoncello, we don't grow a lot of lemons in Oregon, so we are getting those from California. But we try to keep it as close as we can. We recently bought a farm, and we've been growing some of the botanicals for some of our other spirits. We make an absinthe, and we grow the wormwood there. So really try to keep it as close as we can to the distillery, which is awesome. As far as our whiskeys, that, we make a lot of things, but our whiskeys are our favorite thing. And like I said, this is our top selling product. We are fairly confident, it's a little hard because the numbers aren't out there, that we have the largest bourbon barrel inventory in the state of Oregon. We make a lot of whiskey, and we've got a bunch of warehouses around town. And that is our whiskey. That's our stuff. We do use a hybrid still, so we're not on the pot still game, but we think that it makes great whiskey, and yeah.
Yeah, it is really wonderful, and it's so fun to be able to compare it side by side with the Sonoma because they are very different given the similar mash bill.
Yeah.
Yours, what did you say the percentage of rye was in yours again?
Ours is 18%. Yeah. So it's a decent rye content. Yeah.
Yeah, it does drink kind of like a high rye bourbon, and it has that spice character to it on the finish that's very predominant.
The pepper note is quite pleasing. Not overwhelming, but
no,
but present. Yeah.
Yeah, we really like it. We always kind of joke that, consumers tend to self-identify and say, I'm a bourbon drinker, or I'm a rye drinker, and they kind of get like staunch in their, set ways. And we're always like, yeah, but it's all a spectrum, right? Because you can have a high rye bourbon and you can have a rye that has a good amount of corn in it. And like, so if you just like, it can, depending on your mood, how spicy do you want it? How sweet do you want it? Really, this is a fun example of that, I think, where this, for the people who like spice, this or find bourbon maybe to be a little too sweet for them sometimes, this is a beautiful example of like filling that space.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah,
that was
Thanks,
wonderful.
Hannah.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you after we finish up our last two here.
All right,
Alex from Mad River.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Hilton. I'm here from Mad River Distillers, and I just want to start off by saying I am very happy to be in the company of all these fine distillers. It seems like we are all a bunch of like-minded folks. So Mad River Distillers, we started in 2011 in central Vermont. We're a small craft distiller. We focus on whiskeys and rums predominantly, and we do seasonally make an apple brandy. I guess like Hannah, I would start with the whiskey, the bourbon that we are presenting here tonight is our Burnt Rock Bourbon. This is a bourbon that we initially launched as a special release. It is 70% corn, 15% malted barley that we smoke on maple wood, and then 15% rye as well. So it starts, for me anyway, this bourbon, it starts in the palate as a really sweet, followed by spice, and then a really subtle smoke note on the finish, which I hope that you all can find there. So as I said, we started in 2011. We started as total newbies. I actually came into the business. I was hired to renovate and build out the distillery. My former career was, as a contractor. So that's how I came into this, totally by happenstance. We are located on an old horse farm in central Vermont. So we occupy currently 2 old barns that were located on the property, and we make excuse me, sorry, I'm a little nervous here.
You're doing wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. I guess I haven't had enough bourbon tonight. Yeah, so I came in from a construction side of things, and we were all self-taught. I had 2 business partners when we started, and we started with rum, corn whiskey, and eventually started to learn the ropes a little bit and started producing our bourbon and our rye whiskey. Our Burnt Rock Bourbon is something that was kind of an experiment that we decided to produce. We built a smoker kind of in the backyard of the distillery, and we decided that we would take some of our malted barley and we would throw it on the smoker and add that into the mash bill. And the Burnt Rock Bourbon is kind of what came from that. It's aged for a minimum of 2 years, so it's a straight bourbon. And it caught on and gained popularity as we started to release it kind of seasonally. And so now we've started to kind of add it into the rotation, and we're starting to make it year round. So it's done really well for us, and we're excited to have it in our year-round lineup.
Yeah, and it's funny because the smoke isn't super heavy. You know, it's not like it's there, but it's very delicate, and it's a really
Yeah, that
lovely,
nuanced touch of it is admirable.
I think actually this is probably the one we should use. So we had an event prior to this. We had a corporate event that was a whiskey tasting, and we sent a cocktail smoker to all the guests with it. So they all got a cocktail smoker, and we were thinking when we do our happy hour later, maybe we'll make a smoked old fashioned with one of these. And I feel like this burnt rock might be perfect for the.
It's already got this.
Yeah, it already has a little bit of that smoke going in it. So it's really quite beautiful, and it's a fun, because it is like these first four were kind of standards, the wrong word, but traditional bourbons, and these last two that we have here have something, a little element, a little fun going on with them, a little something different.
Sure. So, I would add, so as I said, when we first kind of came up with the idea for this bourbon, like we built a little smoker in our backyard, and we kind of, went through the motions of trying to figure that out. And then subsequently, as we've started to produce more, we realized that, smoking the grain ourselves was something that probably wasn't going to be that sustainable and, that efficient for our purpose. So, we reached out to our local malt house, which is Valley Malt in Hadley, Massachusetts, where we source all of our malt from and all of our grain from. And so they decided, they had experimented with some other smoked malts and some peated malts, but they started using a Maplewood smoked malt. And I think, I'm not sure if we're the only distillery that they do the maple for, but they do a bunch of different smoked malts now, I think, as a result of this project that we kind of kicked off probably 6 years ago. So
Kudos, that's great. And the smokiness, if you haven't tried it with the beef jerky.
With the meat hearts. Yeah, it is quite good with that. Yeah, Valley Malt is actually right down the street from where I grew up. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. So Valley Malt is they're a great malt house for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting, everyone. Like, I feel almost remiss that the first time I'm introducing you all to Mad River Distillers is for whiskey rather than rum, because their rum is what I first learned about, and their rum is mind-blowingly good. And actually,
Suzanne was raving about it years and years ago.
And for those of you who think rum is just for like rum and cokes and that's all that, or like
tiki drinks,
like, move over whiskey, like craft rum in America.
You can't say that during a bourbon tasting.
I mean, but you can sip rum like you can sip whiskey. And I feel like a lot of people don't really realize that, they're just thinking of like the heavier rums and things of that nature. And Mad River is a great example of that. And they do some really fun things with maple with their rum as well.
Yes. Being in Vermont, maple is definitely something that is on the minds of most people who visit here. So yeah, we do. We do a maple cask rum, not to digress, but I would say, also, starting out, kind of being new to the scene and being self-taught, rum was one of the first things that we started to experiment with, frankly, just for frankly, its ease of production. And then as we got a little more comfortable with our equipment, we started to kind of like divulge into making whiskeys. And now I would say it's probably like a 50-50 split between whiskeys and rums, but we do definitely pride ourselves in the rum that we make as well. So
and it's as appropriate for Vermont as maple is, because rum was what was produced there before the states became the states. That was
Massachusetts. I mean, I think at one point,
New England, really.
Yeah, all of New England, and I think at one point there were like, I want to say there were like 300 rum distilleries in the like early New England colonies, or like very early on there were like so many rum distilleries in New England, and that was like really
absolutely, I would agree with that. Yeah, I believe I've read that there were nearly 1,000 rum distilleries at some point. Pre-prohibition. So kind of an interesting fact about New England that most people don't realize, but rum is actually something that was made here long ago.
Yeah.
It wasn't the tea tax that caused the revolution.
The
it was
molasses
the tax
tax.
on molasses.
That
Indeed.
really
Yes.
Yeah, that's
you can take my tea, but don't take my rum.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And actually, for all of our SipScout members, I think our August kit is going to be an American craft rum kit. So we're going to dive deep into American craft rum and get you some good examples so you can see what we're talking about. And hopefully Mad River will be one of those because they make some delicious rums.
Alex, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. We're going to finish us off here with our last bourbon of the evening, and then we'll open it up happy hour style so all you can hang out with us.
So,
Savage and Cooke with their fancy bottle.
so this is a bourbon whiskey called the Burning Chair. And Savage and Cooke is a distillery that's located in the Bay Area. It's on Mare Island. If you ever are in the Bay Area, they have gorgeous facility, lovely
Gorgeous
property.
facility.
This was a distillery that was founded by a fellow named Dave Finney. And I don't know if that name rings a bell to any of you, but if you are familiar with the wine called The Prisoner, he is the winemaker responsible for The Prisoner and the rest of the Orange Swift portfolio. He recently, actually, it's not all that recently now, sold The Prisoner and the rest of the Orange Swift brand. And part of the selling of that included a non-compete clause in his contract that prevented him from making wine. And so he said, well, I'm not going to just sit here. And so he decided to open a distillery. And it's a remarkable property, and it's interesting because he's got his hands in everything. Picked up distilling. He's also like tanning leather hides and raising cattle out there on Mare Island. It's this whole
I think we have a full restaurant at the distillery now too. Yeah,
it's all over the place.
Yeah.
But this bourbon is fun because we were discussing the last two are a little bit skewed, a little bit different. This one being smoked, and then this one is finished in previously used Grenache wine barrels. So the influence of his background with wine is something that is prevalent in the Savage and Cooke brands or the Savage and Cooke portfolio. He makes an agave spirit that he ages in old Chardonnay barrels. And you get a little bit of that tinge of color.
You do get a little bit of that like pinkish red tinge, just a tiny bit. Yeah.
But yeah, this is another fun, I guess, example of the way that a lot of craft distillers are kind of pushing the envelope and seeing what can I do to this to make it distinct. And while that's not always resulting in the thing that you want to drink the most, it can be. Sometimes, aging your wine in bourbon barrels as opposed to aging your bourbon in wine barrels. And I don't know. Sorry, frankly, a lot of those bourbon and whiskey barrel aged wines that I've tried,
they haven't figured that out just yet.
It's a work in progress. But I feel like this shines.
Yeah, it does. It's very smooth. I feel like the finishing kind of, it just rounds out the edges a little bit.
And the berry characteristic of, a ripe, fresh wine like Grenache, I think, can be noted here, especially in the front, like the initial entry on the palate.
Yeah,
it's wonderful.
Yeah, it is really fun to see how, because I think a lot of times people are like, oh, bourbon tasting, all 6 of them are going to kind of taste the same. But I think this lineup has shown a very good example of how diverse you can be within one style of craft alcohol, So like we said before, we had kind of like more butterscotchy, then more foresty, then more grainy, then this one was a little spicier, and then we have the maple kind of the smoke maple characteristics here, and then kind of that berry finishing. So it's a really fun space. And so if you're stuck in that rut where you're drinking the same bourbon all the time, hopefully this encourages you to get out there and try new craft brands, and we've learned from, Colin tonight, flip over the bottle and see if it says distilled by versus just bottled by or produced by, right? So that you can make sure the people you're buying it from are actually making it. Because I think the variety is wonderful. And that's why, here at the Crafty Cats, whenever people say something to us like, I don't like bourbon, we say, you just haven't tried enough bourbons to find the one you like yet. Be persistent. You will find one because the variety is huge. And so whatever your palate is, and the more you use those whiskey tasting techniques that we were teaching at the beginning, the more you'll be able to articulate to someone what you like and what you don't like so that you can find more of what you like.
And
Sorry, I went on a tangent.
no, that's fine, because it actually is an important thing to note. In full disclosure, Savage and Cooke is actually discontinued the burning chair
This one, yeah.
because of the aging requirements to make a bourbon, or at least the self-imposed aging requirements to make the bourbon that Dave Finney wanted to make for Savage and Cooke. He was purchasing previously distilled product, and his artistic influence was the decision to age it in these old Grenache barrels. This is being discontinued because they are now releasing their own
That they've distilled in-house.
Bourbon. It just takes a little time to distill it and barrel it and get it to the point that you're ready to go.
And that is one thing to keep in mind. So if you find something you love, go do your research a little bit, because the reason that they might not be distilling it right now is because they have stuff in barrels and they're not there yet. And so then that's also often why a lot of craft distillers start out with clear spirits. So vodkas, gins, rums, things of that nature, because you have to wait a few years for your whiskey to be ready. And most small businesses can't just sit there and wait for the money to start coming in, right?
Fill up the warehouse and no revenue.
So in that regard, sometimes purchasing and, but there's also a way to purchase something and still have your hands on it and still have an artisanal expression on it, still be involved in the production. You can do contract distilling instead of purchasing, right? So there are ways to still do it where it shows that ultimately you want to be producing your own product. And so now their new whiskey, is made by them as well.
And yes, Jay, this is the last of it. They are
find it.
No longer producing this.
Yep.
So if you can get your hands on it,
go find it online and grab it if you like it. And then also I'll throw in the chat, our friends at Low Gap have given us a nice little discount for anyone who likes our first whiskey that we were tasting a lot. So you can go get some of that. So I'll throw that in the chat as well. But now we are ready for happy hour.
Hey now.
So everyone, I'm going to promote everyone to panelist, and you can decline it, and then you'll just stay exactly how you are, so you can keep listening in to the fun, and you don't have to turn your camera on or turn your audio on or anything. Or if you would like to turn your camera on and you'd like to unmute yourself and talk with the distillers and talk with everyone here, you can do that. And so that's always kind of fun. And I will invite all of our featured makers to kind of join us, and all of our representatives who are here with us today. Thank you so much, first of all. Let's do a cheers before we do this, because sometimes people do have to drop off right at this point. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. If you do have to drop off, I hope you had as much fun as we did. And thank you, Hannah,
It's been a
Crispin,
pleasure having you all.
Colin, Alex. You were amazing, really. And you were all very timely. I'm very proud of you. It's very hard to stay on time when you're so passionate about something. Cheers, everyone. You'll get that notification momentarily after I take my sip. And then Hannah, Crispin, Colin, Alex, feel free to unmute yourselves, and you guys can just kind of jump in if there's any conversations you want to start, or Evan, if you have any questions you want to jump in with to get the conversation started here.